We're really fortunate today. We've got, it's not the likely to say this, we've got one of our geography's rising stars here for you today. This is Dr. Alex Manby. He's a human geographer with us, and he is going to be talking about geographies of nationalism. So round of applause.
Cool, thank you so much. It's really great to see all of you. A bit of context is I studied the undergraduate degree here in Oxford from 2013 to 2016, and I really remember coming to this open day and sitting in the position that you guys are in now. So good luck to you all, and hopefully we'll see some of you here next year. So as Nick said, I'm a human geographer. I'm a lecturer here in the School of Geography and the Environment, but I'm also a college tutor at Mansfield College, right? So you probably had an overview from Nick about how the college system works, but I deliver lectures here in the department and then run college tutorials for our students at Mansfield. And I'm a political and historical geographer, but my research is particularly interested in how communities who are excluded from statecraft, right, communities who are excluded from statehood nevertheless engage in aspects of statecraft. So I look at how indigenous, minority and stateless communities engage in international politics or do diplomacy effectively. And I've been in this role since 2023, but before that I did my PhD here in Oxford and undergraduate degree at St John's College as well. So the lecture I'm going to give today is a slightly shortened version of one that I normally give to the first year human geography students on the geographies of nationalism and fascism. Okay, but because we've only got half an hour today, I'm just going to talk about the geographies of nationalism. And this is one of kind of 8 lectures that you get around the theme of geographies of power and identity. So you have ones on nationalism, citizenship, territory, sovereignty, and so on as part of that first year human geography course. And what I want to do with this lecture really is to offer a kind of political geographical reading of nationalism. Okay, so to think a little bit about what does it mean to study a phenomena like nationalism as a human geographer, and how might that be different to if you were studying it as a historian or someone doing PPE or someone doing international relations or even something like anthropology. And I want us to think a bit about what nationalism is, how it functions, and what a specifically geographical reading to the study of nationalism involves. So the lecture, quite crudely, has 4 parts. First, we'll think about what nationalism is, so the relationship between nationalism and other core concepts within human geography, ideas of the state, sovereignty, territory, etc. Next, we'll think a little bit about how historians and social scientists have theorised the origins of nationalism. So this question of the when of nationalism, when did nationalism come into being, when did it emerge, when did the nation become salient. Then I want to think a bit about theoretical perspectives on the how and the where of nationalism. Okay, so we'll think about geographical scholarship on everyday nationalism, which thinks about how the nation is reproduced and the specific spaces in which it emerges as salient. And what I want to argue in this lecture is that nationalism is more than just a specific ideology, right? But it also operates through a range of different everyday practices. And then we'll take a brief detour and think about alternative nationalisms. So we'll think about nationalisms, or a couple of examples of nationalisms, as they emerge in the global south, specifically thinking about this moment of administrative decolonisation. And finally, I'll end with a discussion of 2 very brief case studies. So we'll think about COVID-19 and the geographies of national belonging, and we'll talk a little bit about my own research on the Naga community in northeast India. So just before we start, I just want to introduce you to some kind of core terms which I'll use throughout this lecture, and I think you'll probably be familiar with lots of them already. But the first then is the state. And we can think of the state as a centralised set of institutions facilitating coercive power and governing capabilities over a defined territory. So we can see already that there's this really interesting relationship between space, in this sense defined as control over territory, and the exercise of state power. So the second key term I want to talk about is the nation. So this might be a term that's familiar to you, I'm sure. So a named human population sharing a historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, and a common economy and common legal rights and duties for all members. And finally, if we bring these ideas together, then we have the nation state. So a sovereign state of which most of the citizens or subjects are also united by factors which define a nation, right, such as language or common descent. And very broadly, the world of sovereign nation states emerges at decolonisation in the mid-20th century to replace the world of empires, right? And it's the primary way in which international politics is organised today. So the nation state is kind of the currency of international politics. So very broadly then, nation states tend to exist where the territorial boundaries of the nation map neatly onto the territorial boundaries of the state. So far so good. But there are a few caveats, so nothing straightforward in geography, which complicate this picture slightly. The first is there are a lot more nations than there are states. Okay, so you might have heard of some of them. We can think about the Tibetan nation, the Kurdish nation, the Crimean Tatars, the Scots, the Quebecy nation in Canada. There's numerous indigenous nations that lack states, right, or have never had a state. And we'll discuss one so-called stateless nation, the Naga community in northeast India, at the end of this lecture. And what you'll find is that many of these communities aspire to statehood, but not all of them, and most of them that do aspire for statehood are unlikely to ever get it. And this struggle for statehood and for self-determination, defined in terms of forms of nationalism, has been an important driver of world history, right? Particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And then the other caveat here is that many states encompass more than one nation. So the most familiar one to you all should be obviously the United Kingdom, or we have the Scottish, Welsh, English and Irish nations, but lots of other countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, sorry this keeps moving without me touching it, South America, often contain multiple nations, right? So we have indigenous First Nation communities. So in this context then, I want us to think a little bit about what is nationalism. So the political geographers Joe Painter and Alex Jeffrey argue that nationalism is an ideology whose power is derived from its ability to mobilise individuals towards collective goals, where the survival and well-being of the individual is mapped onto the survival and well-being of the collective, the nation. So this fusing of the individual and the collective community. And what we often see is that nationalist belonging tends to be derived also from a shared attachment to a collective homeland. Now that collective homeland can be real or imagined, right? So sometimes has a territorial dimension, sometimes it doesn't. And what you'll find in the literature, or what you might find in the literature, is that scholars will often distinguish between civic and ethnic nationalism. Okay, so civic nationalism is seen in terms of an allegiance to the nation state, expressed in terms of ideas of citizenship. And here nationalism then is a set of state-building practices, a way of binding people together, whereas ethnic nationalism is about being born and raised in a particular place with a shared language, religion, culture, etc. Now in practice this definition is slippery, right? Because most forms of ethnic nationalism have a civic component and most forms of civic nationalism have an ethnic component. And we can see that both civic and ethnic nationalism can be exclusionary. So we can think about how in the French context, for instance, often seen as the kind of paradigmatic model of civic nationalism, we have these ongoing debates about the extent to which Islamic dress should be banned in public, right? So this fusing of civic and ethnic nationalism together. And another term you'll often see associated with nationalism is this idea of patriotism, right? Where nationalism is represented as the ugly version of patriotism. So patriotism is seen as the love for one's country, while nationalism is seen as support for the interests of one's own nation to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. But again, I think these definitions, or the difference between these definitions is slippery. They often blur, and the terms are used interchangeably, particularly within nationalist movements. But what I want you to take from this lecture is that nationalism is an explicitly global phenomenon, right? One that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries with Enlightenment, but which really spread in the 19th and 20th centuries. And we can think a little bit about why that was the case in a moment. And what we'll see is, if we think historically, many wars have been driven by nationalism, but it's also played a crucial role in anti-colonial struggles in both repressive and emancipatory ways. And this kind of ambivalence of nationalism is something we'll come back to towards the end of the lecture. And the other key thing I want to stress is that nationalism is really entwined with lots of other core terms or concepts within human geography. So the territorial state, sovereignty, gender, citizenship, race and belonging, and so on. So just now we've defined nationalism, I want us to think a little bit about how scholars have theorised the emergence of nationalism. So this question of what nationalism is and when did it emerge? And specifically, I want to introduce you to two approaches. So the first is primordialism. And I want to be clear that this is an approach you're unlikely to find promoted in an academic context, but I think it's important for us to learn about because it continues to inform popular understandings of nationhood, right, as they're articulated within popular culture. So primordialists very crudely believe that nations... Sorry, there's some problem with this screen. Primordialists believe that nations are an intrinsic part of human nature, right? That nationhood is kind of in our DNA, even though it doesn't really have a biological basis. And primordialists argue that nations possess essential qualities of race, so relationship to the soil, ethnicity, language and so on. And really extreme primordialists might argue that the nation is something that we've actually inherited from the animal kingdom, right? A kind of evolutionary upscaling of the idea of pack. So you have the wolf pack, and then that translates into the nation within human societies. But most commonly, primordialists would argue that nations have at least pre-modern roots. Okay, so very broadly, that they've been around for thousands of years. And some primordialist views also draw from explicitly religious teachings. So we might think about Christian teachings, which understand nations as preordained by God. And the key thing is this is a very exclusionary form of nationalism. It relies on a logic of othering to differentiate those who are seen as inside and outside the nation. And I want to stress that this is an approach that's been discredited by most or essentially all scholars, right? So I'm not saying this is something you should, go home and talk and say, I learned about primordialism today and that explains how nations operate. But it's important to learn because it can still be found in more radical forms of ethnic nationalism that have re-emerged in recent years. So the task for us as scholars or as students is to identify these forms of nationalism and then to critique them. And one man who still believes in primordialist theories of the nation is Vladimir Putin, right? And this view has really important implications if we want to understand the war in Ukraine. Because essentially Putin refuses to believe that Ukraine is a fully fledged nation, okay? So he claims that the idea of the Ukrainian nation and an independent Ukrainian state were both invented by the Bolsheviks or the communists in the early 20th century, and he doesn't really accept that there's any kind of distinct Ukrainian language or a Ukrainian history independently of Russia. But I think what Putin misses, and what we'll explore in this lecture, is that nations can often be forged in very short periods of time, right? Often against external opponents, in this case Putin's Russia. So if you look at polling data from eastern Ukraine, with the caveat that it's not hugely easy to collect, we can see how these areas that might previously have been ambivalent about future reintegration with Russia before the war have now widely embraced a Ukrainian national identity since the conflict began, right? But this is something you won't see if you're a primordialist because you believe that nations are a timeless element of history. They're not something that's socially constructed. But very crudely, what we see by the 1960s is that new understandings of the nation and nationalism emerge amongst historians and social scientists. And these are often termed modernist perspectives. Okay? So in opposition to primordialist understanding, modernist approaches suggest that rather than being ancient or timeless, nations and nationalisms arose with the advent of modernity. So they arose in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, and the task for us as scholars is to explore the social and economic conditions which brought them into being. So most modernist approaches argue that the emergence of nationalism was associated with 19th century industrialisation and the move from agrarian to industrial societies. And perhaps the single most important book about the origins and the spread of nationalism is this one, Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, published in 1983. And what Anderson argues in this book is that the invention of the printing press was crucial to the emergence of nationalism. Okay, so this sounds like quite a dry, technocratic explanation. But specifically, Anderson argues that the increased circulation of the written word in newspapers, books and magazines, alongside the establishment of new educational institutions, fostered a sense of national belonging in the 18th and 19th century. And very crudely, the printing press meant that two people, one of them in Newcastle, let's say, one of them in Exeter, could both read the same newspaper each morning, right? And they could both keep up with the same society gossip, both follow the same political events, both read the same kind of cultural stories, and this gave them kind of shared reference points transmitted through language, which created a sense of similarity and connectedness between two people who would never meet. So Anderson has this very famous definition of the nation, where he says that the nation is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear them. Yet in the minds of each, there's the image of their communion. And what he means by this, essentially, is that we can all imagine how other members of our nation might look, speak, or act, the clothes they might wear, the behaviours they might express, even if we'd never met them, right? Okay, and we can think about the particular imaginaries of the British nation, right, or the English nation, or the Welsh nation that come into your head, and you can imagine what other members of your nation look like, even if you haven't met them. So that's really key to Anderson's definition. So for Anderson, national identity then is constantly reproduced through these subtle linguistic mechanisms, so these shared reference points which mould us into an imagined community. And language and culture are both really important here, right? So Anderson writes about the printing press, but scholars have since looked at how other forms of media, things like TV, radio, social media, also foster ideas of national belonging and the development of national identities. And something I really want to emphasise, and this is where students often go wrong with Benedict Anderson's work, is that in claiming that all nations are imagined, Anderson isn't arguing that nations are unreal, right? Or that they're fragile or that they're without consequence. We've already seen in the Ukraine example how they're not. These imagined connections are really vital to how people understand their lives. And nationalism is a really powerful force in shaping social, political and economic conditions. And there's been quite a lot of debate in the literature about the extent to which this process of nation building was deliberately engineered by a kind of capitalist elite. This would be a Marxist perspective, or whether the nation was something that emerged in more kind of haphazard or decentralised manners. And again, this is something you'll think about if you study the course here. Okay, so here's just a very broad schematic explanation of the points that I've been making so far. So we've seen this shift from understandings of the nation as naturally occurring to an understanding of the nation as socially constructed. Okay, so something that's created and accepted by people within a society and something that exists as a result of human interaction. So Anderson's publishing in the early 1980s, and by the 1990s we see a shift amongst scholars away from these earlier debates about the when of nationalism, okay, so when nationalism was created, whether it's a modernist creation, and the what of nationalism. Is it a primordialist desire, right? Is it a cultural and linguistic construct? Towards a focus on the how and the where of nationalism, okay? So scholars have since sought to understand how nationhood became institutionalised within states, and when it's established, how and where do ordinary people come to express, perform and reproduce the nation in everyday practices, right? And geographers have been particularly influential in these debates, and have tried to introduce more nuanced understanding of the agency of the individual. Okay, so the role of you as an individual in reproducing the nation. Okay, so to move away from these kind of long historical narratives to think about the role of the nation in everyday life. And political geographers in particular are interested in the sites, the actors, the spaces, and places and objects in which nationalism is reproduced in our everyday lives. So what I want to do now is just very briefly discuss two examples of this kind of geographical perspective on nationalism and this work on everyday nationalism. So the first is Michael Billig's work on banal nationalism. And the idea here is that studies of nationalism have really tended to focus on big events, right? Wars, revolutions, flag waving, national celebrations, and violent nationalist movements. Okay? And Billig calls these kind of violent events hot nationalist contexts. But what he argues is that this focus on extreme nationalist contexts means we miss the much more subtle and routine ways in which nationalism infiltrates everyday life, right? So we might think about how every time, I know people don't really use banknotes very much anymore, but every time you use a banknote and you see a picture of the king, right, you're reminded of kind of an idea of British nationhood. Or every time you watch the weather forecast and you see a map of Great Britain, you're reminded of the territory of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So all these subtle things are reminding us of the nation, often without us realising it. So banal nationalism is about taking seriously these much more subtle mechanisms through which we're reminded of the nation in our everyday life. So far from being a kind of background mood in established nations, far from being an intermittent mood in established nations, Billig argues that nationalism is the endemic condition. What he really means by that is he says that nationalism is always something that's operating in the background. It's not just happening through these big violent political events that we've discussed. So as geographer Griffith notes, Billig's banal nationalism isn't about a flag being waved passionately at events, but is more about a flag hanging limply and unnoticed in the back of a public building, right? So if you go to get your passport renewed, you might see a flag hanging limply behind the passport desk, and that's a kind of subtle reminder of the nation. And Billig's interesting because he's not a geographer, right? He's a psychologist, but geographers have really used his theories of banal nationalism to think about how popular culture, food and clothing all reproduce ideas of the nation in everyday ways, right? And the really key thing here is that nationalism is something that's reproduced at the scale of the body. So a really nice example of this is Tim Edensler's work on automobility. Okay, and what he really means by that is driving. And Edensler looks at how automobility shapes and reflects national identity. So on the one hand, particular cars are seen as representative of a British identity. You might think about the Mini, right, as a kind of archetypal British car in the mid-20th century. But we might also think about how national identity is performed through driving. Okay, so some of you might be learning to drive at the moment or have recently learned, but we acquire practical knowledge required to operate a car legally via membership of a nation, right? And different countries will have different requirements to pass that driving test. And we perform national identity by engaging in proper road etiquette. So we can think about all the assumptions, the national assumptions about, French drivers, British drivers, German drivers, etc. All of these practices of driving are ways of performing a particular national identity. Okay, so that's what Tim Edens argues. And he also gives this example, if you ever get the ferry to France, when you get off the ferry, coming back to the UK, you see British road signs and you feel you're at home, right? So he's interested in how things like road signs provide this subtle reminder of British identity. And there's lots of other work in this genre looking at things like the Captain America comic books, right? And thinking about how that reproduces particular ideas of American identity, or work on kind of road signs in Wales, thinking about how that promotes Welsh identities. But Billig's work is really influential in thinking about how nationalism is reproduced in these really subtle and everyday ways, right? And the spaces in which this happens. But the problem is that Billig was writing in 1995, okay? And arguably we've now re-entered a period of hot nationalism. So we need other kind of theoretical and conceptual approaches that can help us understand the contemporary moment, right? So this brings me on to the kind of second key geographical approach to the study of nationalism. And this is known as affective nationalism. And the really key thing here is that nationalism isn't something that's only symbolised or flagged through certain objects, as scholars of banal nationalism might think about, but is instead more than symbolic, right? Nationalism is something that's sensed, it's felt, and experienced. And this work draws from cultural geography and something called non-representational theory that you might learn about if you end up doing a geography degree. But the key scholar here is someone called Angrahad Closs-Stevens at the University of Swansea. And she wrote this very popular article a few years ago where she talks about the atmospheres of nationalism at the 2012 Olympics. And what she describes is how people, after the Olympic opening ceremony, sold bottles of air which they'd claimed to have captured from the stadium, right? And they sold them on eBay after the London 2012 Olympics. And they claimed that these bottles captured the electric mood of the event, right? So you had this electric mood had been captured in this bottle. And obviously this is a really silly thing to do, but it speaks to how there was a particular perceived national feeling in the stadium that people wanted to capture, right? So if any of you were in London at that time, or you went to any of the London 2012 Olympic events, people talked about how there was this real sense of excitement and pride in the air during this period all across London. And Closs-Stevens describes these feelings in terms of atmospheres, right? We can feel them around us. They're moody force fields which move between us and congeal around particular objects, materials, and bodies in particular times and particular places. And she talks about how these atmospheres of nationalism at the Olympics, or of national belonging, were created by a whole range of factors. Things like the BBC theme music, right? I remember watching the Olympics and you feel very excited when you hear the Olympic theme music, the music playing in the stadiums, the corporations sponsoring the games, staff working at in the stadiums, right? They were called games makers or something like that. And she suggests that these national atmospheres tend to be heightened in particular spaces at particular moments. So in these kind of large sporting events or public commemorations or national holidays. And what's really crucial is these kind of national feelings aren't the same for everyone. So while some people, a British flag might foster feelings of pride, for others it could be associated with much more negative emotions. And we can also think about how these affective atmospheres of nationalism operate in much more sinister ways. So we might think about events like the Nuremberg rallies in Nazi Germany or far-right rallies today. So our task as geographers is to think about the different intensities and tonalities of nationalism. So when is nationalism more or less intense, and what is its character? To what end is national feeling working towards? So Closs-Stevens' work encourages us to think about the processes through which the nation is felt, embodied and activated, and the role of emotions and atmospheres in the reproduction of the nation. Now, before I just get onto our case studies, I just want to very quickly take a detour. So most of the approaches to nationalism I've described so far have emerged from or to describe Western contexts, okay? So Billig and Closs-Stevens are both writing about the UK, while Anderson's analysis largely pertains to Western Europe and to a lesser extent South America. But a key part of a geographical approach to the study of nationalism, and why a geographical approach might be distinct to those other disciplines I mentioned earlier, involves investigating how theories of nationalism, theories and practices of nationalism play out in different geographical contexts, right? So as I said earlier, nationalism emerged in Europe in the 18th century and it quickly spread around the world. Now that's true, but it doesn't mean that non-Western nationalisms were necessarily derivative, right, or directly copied European nationalisms. Instead, anti-colonial nationalisms in Africa and Asia sought to rethink ideas of the nation according to local circumstances, histories and aspirations. So the political scientist Adam Getachew writes about how African anti-colonial nationalist leaders in the 1960s sought to reimagine meanings of the nation beyond the nation state, right? With reference to ideas of Pan-Africanism and attempts to build common political, social and economic systems between citizens of these different countries. So rethinking the nation in this much more kind of inclusive way. And these kind of anti-colonial nationalist movements were also internationalists. So they were about imagining alternative political futures or visions of global politics which go beyond the nature. So this kind of Pan-Africanist vision of global politics. So this was a nationalism that wasn't simply articulated in terms of identity and essence, but was one expressed in terms of solidarity, inclusivity, and connection between nations that emerged at decolonisation. And another example you might be familiar with is the Haitian Revolution in the early 19th century, right? Discussed in the book The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, which emerged against slavery and French colonial rule in the Caribbean. So the revolution was successful, it was essentially the only successful slave revolution in history, and it led to Haitian independence in 1804. But what's really interesting is this protest movement drew upon and articulated the emancipatory language of the French Revolution, right? So these Haitian revolutionaries talked in terms of French forms of civic nationalism, ideas of liberty and equality, and they refashioned them as tools to overcome slavery in the Caribbean. So they essentially said, well, you know, these French nationalist movements are kind of making these claims in terms of the French Revolution, in terms of liberty and equality, we should get those things too. So scholars often consider the French Revolution to be the single most important moment for the circulation of nationalist ideas across Europe. But what we see here is that the geographies it created were much broader. Okay, so I just want to end the lecture by thinking about how we might apply the different theories of nationalism to two case studies. Okay, so first I want to take you back to spring 2020. So this is the first lockdown. If you were living in the UK, I think you guys would have been in your first couple of years at secondary school. And what I want to do is argue that the lockdown offers us a really useful lens to understand the everyday geographies of nationhood. And specifically to think about how these ideas of national belonging are constructed through media, symbols and shared experiences. And I'm drawing from Klaus Stevens and Bernhardt's chapter on nationalism in Introducing Human Geographies here. So if we start with the media and our discussion of Benedict Anderson's work, we can think about how the televised COVID briefings where Boris Johnson stood in front of a lectern and reminded us as a country that we were all fighting the virus together. So while we'll never meet the tens of millions of people who watch these broadcasts, these daily briefings gave people across the UK a common experience, right? It made them feel like they were part of an imagined community. You might also remember the Queen's broadcast to the nation at the start of lockdown, watched by more than 24 million people. So in her speech, the Queen compared the sacrifices made by key workers during COVID to those made by Britons living in the Blitz. And she ended her speech by quoting the 1939 Vera Lynn song, "We'll Meet Again." And in the process, the Queen defined a sense of British national identity by suggesting not only that British people share in a common present and future, but they also have a shared past, right? A shared history. Michael Billig's work on banal nationalism can help us understand the role of everyday objects and symbols in reproducing nationhood in this period. So in this slide, we might think about the limp Union Jack flag hanging in the background as a kind of subtle reminder of British identity. But we also can think about how people across the UK stuck rainbow stickers and posters in their windows to show support for key workers in national institutions like the NHS and schools. And these grassroots efforts emerged organically, right? And they weren't necessarily designed to be national symbols. I don't think children putting rainbows up in windows thought they were doing something nationalist. But they acquired a distinctive meaning in the context of the pandemic, right? And amidst these efforts by politicians like Boris Johnson and the Queen to narrate this sense of a national community. And we can also think about how that work on affective atmospheres of nationalism can help us understand the significance of events like Clap for Carers in fostering feelings of national belonging amongst people living across the UK. And again, like the rainbow posters, Clap for Carers wasn't designed to be nationalistic, but in this context of these more coordinated top-down efforts by politicians to construct ideas of belonging, ideas of national identity, they acquired this very particular meaning, right? And they helped to foster a nationalised atmosphere. But what the pandemic also reveals is how these efforts to construct a nation always involve processes of both inclusion and exclusion, right? So defining who is inside the nation also involves defining who is outside of it. So while the events and processes I described left many people feeling energised and part of a national community, For others, these same processes were associated with feelings of exclusion, right? And they were contested. So we can think about how in summer 2020 we saw thousands of people across the UK protest in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And these protests quickly spread across the UK and led to the toppling of the slave trader statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. And in many ways, these protests emerged in opposition to racialised understandings about nationhood in the UK, one which understands both Englishness and Britishness in terms of whiteness. And both of these events were accompanied by calls for greater racial equality in public life and for Britain to acknowledge its colonial past. You also might remember how against this politically charged backdrop, the summer of 2020 also saw members of the England football team, supported by their manager Gareth Southgate, begin to take the knee before their football games. And you might remember this received broad public support, but the practice was criticised by politicians, including the then UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel. And she said it was gesture politics, right? And I think this episode tells us something both about the political significance of sport in the UK and football's long been tied to ideas of nationhood. But I think the episode also tells us about how alternative and more inclusive ideas of the nation can emerge from these kind of grassroots efforts, which then exist in tension with these dominant narratives as scripted by politicians. So just for the last couple of minutes, I just want to give you one more example of how I've tried to apply these different geographical approaches to the study of nationalism in my own research. So since 2019, I've been working in an area of northeast India known as Nagaland. So the round circle in the little red section is Nagaland. And Nagaland is a highland area across the India-Myanmar borderland, and it's home to about 2 million indigenous Naga people. Okay, so I could talk a lot about the Naga people, but the key thing here is that the Nagas are ethnically, religious, and linguistically distinct from the rest of India. Okay, very crudely. So on the 14th of August 1947, just one day before Indian independence from Great Britain, the Nagas declared their own independence from India in a memorandum to the United Nations. And they announced that the Nagas were a distinct nation and that they wanted to establish their own independent sovereign nation state of Nagaland, okay, one that would be entirely separate from the rest of India. Now these demands were ignored both by the United Nations and by India, and the Nagas never got their own sovereign state, right? There's a reason that you never heard of the sovereign state of Nagaland. But since 1947, Naga groups have continued to campaign for self-determination, or this right to determine their own political future, both locally in Nagaland and in international forums like the United Nations. So very crudely then, the Nagas are a stateless nation, right? So if we think back to our discussion of those caveats about nationhood earlier, the Nagas are a stateless nation. And if we think back to our discussion of alternative nationalisms, Naga politicians have sought to refashion Western understandings of nationalism to promote an alternative understanding of Naga nationhood, one that's drawn from indigenous Naga traditions rather than explicitly European forms of nationalism. So against this backdrop, my research is concerned with how Naga communities have maintained this sense of nationhood for almost 8 decades, despite being denied their own sovereign state. Okay? And one of the ways that they do that is through nationalist performances and events. So in August 2020, I attended the 74th Naga Independence Day celebrations in Nagaland, hosted by the Naga National Council. So that political group that declared Naga independence in 1947. Now you might be thinking, the Nagas aren't independent, right? There's no recognised state of Nagaland. Why are they having a National Independence Day celebration? And why do they do this every year? So this is the 74th one of these. And that's a good question, and the answer to that is complicated. So on the one hand, these kind of events provide a way for the Nagas to demonstrate to international audiences their capacity for statehood. So during these celebrations, Naga leaders sing the Naga national anthem, they host a military parade, they hoist the Naga flag, which is this one up here. And these are all things that help show outsiders that Nagaland is a state in waiting, okay? One that's ready for nationhood as soon as the international community allows it. Sorry, statehood, as soon as the international community allows it. But on the other hand, these events work to reproduce a sense of Naga nationhood amongst a younger generation of Nagas who weren't alive for those Independence Day declarations in 1947. And that construction of nationhood occurs through the mechanisms we've already discussed. So at the celebrations, Naga politicians narrate the histories of Naga nationhood from ancient times to the present, right? That kind of primordialist understanding of nationhood we mentioned earlier. And in so doing, they foster a sense of collective national memory amongst attendees. And the celebrations are broadcast on YouTube, and you can watch live if you're unable to physically attend in person. The celebrations, the sharing of Naga food and the performance of Naga music all work to foster those effective atmospheres of national belonging that I mentioned earlier, while after the event, Naga communities hang Naga flags across villages as an everyday symbol of Naga claims to nationhood. So there's a lot more that I could discuss here. I could do a whole hour just on this. But this example speaks to how ideas of the nation and nationhood aren't the exclusive preserve of the state. Okay? So these alternative nationalisms are articulated by communities outside of the global north. And the Naga case also speaks to that intersection between nationalism and internationalism, insofar as that these events are used to communicate the Naga claim to explicitly international audiences. Are we cool? So there's just some kind of concluding points to summarise what I've already said, and just some questions on the slide. Well, there were some questions on the slide that you might like to think about afterwards. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex.